welcome to Emily's Book Talk. So, today we will be discussing something that is very, very depressing, but at the same time, it's one of the grand mysteries of life, and it seems to be something that we are all a little bit curious about in a weird way. It's the one thing that all of us as humans have in common, but none of us have ever truly experienced. Well, unless you're a ghost, but I'm hoping that none of you are. Anyways, you've probably guessed what the topic of this book talk is from that description, but if you haven't, today's talk is about death. Now, you're probably wondering why in the world I would want to talk about such a miserable topic. Well, the interesting thing about books is that they are a safe place where we can explore some pretty complex but important topics. We, as readers, get to put ourselves in a character's shoes and see how that character handles a topic like, well, death. Then we can learn how to better deal with things that we will experience or have experienced in real life. So today, I want to introduce you to 3 different books that each discuss death in a unique way. The first book I want to introduce you to is A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness with art by Jim Kay. This story follows our main character named Connor. He's a 13-year-old boy who lives in England with his mother, who is undergoing treatments for her horrible illness in the hopes that she will one day find one that will actually help her. Now, at the beginning of the book, and precisely at 12:07 in the morning in this story itself, a giant monster calls to Connor from outside of his window. But when Connor goes to meet the massive monster outside, he realizes that he is actually not afraid of this monster. The monster then explains that he is going to tell Connor 3 different stories at 3 different times, and then he wants Connor to tell him a 4th story of his own. So, as Connor is dealing with his mother's illness, as well as bullies who won't leave him alone at school, and his very strict grandmother who he has to live with for a while, the monster visits Connor on these 3 different occasions, and always at the time of 12:07, in order to tell him each of his stories. Now, these whimsical stories discuss everything from the tale of a young prince who is trying to overthrow an evil queen, to the tale of a priest who tries to get help from an apothecary, or an old term for a chemist, because his daughters have become very ill. In addition to Patrick Ness's beautiful writing, there are spectacularly dark images that take over a lot of the pages in this book. These illustrations are done by the artist Jim Kay, and they really create this grim but mysterious atmosphere in the book. For example, one of the first images is of the monster himself. This picture spans 2 whole pages and makes the monster look very menacing. Here's an up-close look at the picture of the monster. You will find images like this throughout the whole book, which is awesome and makes the story much more mysterious. So, as Connor listens to each of these stories from the monster, he finds out more and more about himself and the monsters that he has within him. This story looks at death from the eyes of a young boy with a mother who is in the process of dying. This means that Connor has to cope with the complex emotions and consequences that are often involved with grief, including the hope that his mother will get the healing that she needs. To find out the fate of the monster, Connor, and Connor's mother, pick up A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. The next book I would like you to meet is The Ghosts of Heaven by Marcus Sedgwick. This is a mind-bending tale centered around the idea that spirals are everywhere. There are actually 4 short stories that are told within this book, and each story is set in a different time period in history. The first story is told from the perspective of a young girl who lives in prehistoric times at the dawn of the Age of Man, when tribes were forced to hunt and gather and drew the first images on cave walls. This story is unique from the other 3 because it's told in free verse poetry, which just means that it's a fast-paced look at what happens when communication hasn't even really been invented yet, and how this lack of communication can have some pretty dark consequences. The next story is set in the time of the Salem witch trials, so think around the 1600s. In this tale, an innocent young woman is accused of witchcraft, and evidence begins to pile up against her even though she is innocent. People in her village start to turn their backs on her, and she begins to worry that her safe little village is not so safe for her anymore. Another story follows a young doctor in the early 1900s who has just started working at a new mental health institution, or insane asylum, as it is called in the book. This doctor befriends one of the patients who is considered to be very dangerous, but the doctor soon learns that the practices at this mysterious hospital are not as pleasant as they first seemed, and he may have to save the patients before it's too late. The last story is set in the future and follows a young man who has been chosen to ride in a spaceship on its way to a new Earth-like planet, since ours has become too crowded. Our main character is in charge of watching over the other humans on the ship who are safely secured in their individual pods. But as the young man wakes up to check on the spaceship, he begins to notice that things are going terribly wrong. Passengers are dying, and it is up to our main character to save the other passengers before it's too late. Each of the stories in this book look at death in a different time period and from a different perspective. I won't spoil who dies, but I will say that there are lots of spirals in this book, and we might be more connected to the people in our past and future than we may have realized. To find out what the spirals mean and how death plays a key role in the spiral of the universe, pick up Marcus Sedgwick's exhilarating and thought-provoking novel, The Ghosts of Heaven. The last book I would like to introduce you to is Scythe by Neal Shusterman. Unlike the other two books I have introduced you to, this novel explores what it would be like if natural death had been cured. In this futuristic world, death is no longer an issue due to advances in technology, and a computer system known as the Thunderhead is what watches over humanity to make sure nothing goes wrong. Something called a scythedom is formed separate from this Thunderhead in order to manage the size of the population. A scythe's job is to kill, or glean, a certain number of people each year by whatever means they decide. The story in this book follows our two main characters, Citra Terranova and Rowan Damish, who are selected by a scythe named Scythe Faraday to train and compete, as one of them will become a new scythe and officially join the scythedom. Under Scythe Faraday's training, they learn the most ethical ways to choose and glean humans. But as Citra and Rowan begin to learn the art of killing, they realize that not every scythe is as ethical as Scythe Faraday. In fact, they may need to take matters into their own hands if they are going to keep the scythedom out of cruel hands and keep themselves from being killed in the process. Citra and Rowan's adventure takes off from the first page, and they meet various interesting members of the scythedom, like Scythe Curie, who gleaned the U.S. President and Cabinet and is known as the Grand Dame of Death, or Scythe Goddard, who lives in a large mansion and is known for his sadistic gleaning methods and large parties. As the first book in a trilogy, this story is only an introduction to the complex and fascinating world that Neal Shusterman has created. In his first heart-pounding novel, Shusterman shows you a glimpse into a futuristic world that asks, how do we manage overpopulation? Is a scythedom what's best for society? Is an all-knowing thunderhead the best way to control humanity? And was getting rid of natural death the best thing that has happened to the world, or the worst? To find out the answers to these questions, as well as the fate of Rowan, Citra, and the world itself, pick up Scythe by Neal Shusterman. So, as you can see, each of the books I have introduced you to today has tackled the idea of death in a new way, whether it is learning to grieve someone who is in the process of dying, or visiting different time periods to see how death has affected humans throughout history, or traveling to a futuristic world where natural death has been eliminated, each of these stories certainly sheds a new light on how we look at death, and I hope that you will pick up one of these thrilling novels as your next favorite read. Bye!